They say every man is born under a star, but King Charles II of Spain was born under a shadow. Have you ever wondered how much of your life is truly yours? How much of your fate is shaped not by your choices, but by the ghosts of those who came before you? Because power doesn't begin with us. It begins centuries back in the whispers of kings, in the marriages of dynasties, in the greed that stains bloodlines forever. 400 years ago, the most powerful empire on earth wasn't America or Britain. It was Spain. The Spanish Empire ruled oceans, continents, and the very imagination of Europe. From the silver veins of Bolivia to the golden shores of the Philippines, it was said that the sun never set on Spain's empire. But every empire is built on debt, not just of money, but of morality. The Habsburgs, the royal family that ruled Spain, believed that their power was divine, that their blood was chosen by God himself, and to keep that divine blood pure, they married only within their own family, generation after generation of uncles and nieces, cousins and sisters, believing that holiness could be inherited like gold. But blood doesn't obey divine law. It obeys biology. And after centuries of inbreeding, the Habsburg bloodline began to eat itself alive. In 1661, that madness took human form. A child was born in Madrid, a prince who would become King Charles II, the last of his line. His birth was heralded by priests and celebrated by nobles, but the midwives who saw him first whispered in fear. His head was misshapen, his jaw jutted grotesquely forward, his tongue too large to fit in his mouth. His tiny frame trembled as if the weight of the crown had already crushed him. He didn't learn to walk until he was 4, couldn't speak properly until he was 8, and spent most of his youth too sick to leave his bed. The doctors called it deformity. The church called it divine punishment. The people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But what he really was a living warning about what happens when power becomes obsession. Charles was born into an empire already dying. Spain had conquered half the world, but it was rotting from within. Its armies were exhausted, its treasury empty, its people starving. Yet inside the golden walls of Madrid's royal palace, they still pretended that Spain ruled the earth. The portraits painted of the young king showed him handsome, dignified, almost godlike. But those paintings were lies. In reality, the child who would rule an empire could barely stand on his own. When his father, King Philip IV, died, the 5-year-old Charles became the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. A king who couldn't read, couldn't write, and couldn't understand what it meant to rule. Power fell into the hands of his mother, Mariana of Austria, a devout, calculating woman who hid her ambition behind piety. She became queen regent and ruled in her son's name. But her rule was a web of manipulation, guided by priests and confessors who whispered divine approval into her ear while draining the empire's veins. The royal court became a theater of holy corruption. Every decision was wrapped in religion, every failure disguised as God's will. And the boy king, sickly and naive, believed it. He grew up convinced that his suffering was proof of holiness, that his weakness was sacred. The people, however, began to whisper darker things, that the royal family had angered God, that the empire's misfortunes were not divine tests, but divine revenge. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, Spain's once mighty empire was disintegrating. Ships loaded with silver and gold from the New World vanished into the hands of greedy nobles and foreign bankers before reaching the royal treasury. Inflation soared, peasants starved, and riots brewed in the streets. But the court didn't see it. They were too busy praying, too drunk on delusion, too insulated by power. Charles, frail and impressionable, was surrounded by advisors who treated him like a child long after he had become a man. They called him Majesty to his face and mocked him behind his back. His own servants pitied him. They saw how he struggled to eat, how he drooled when he spoke, how he prayed for hours every night asking God to cleanse the curse from his body. His confessor told him that the devil haunted his family. His mother told him that only faith could save him. But faith cannot cure decay. As years passed, the boy grew into a man, but not into a ruler. The empire's foundation was cracking. and everyone could feel it, except perhaps the one man who sat on its throne. In the candlelit halls of the Escorial Palace, he would stare at the portraits of his ancestors, great conquerors, fierce monarchs, emperors who had once commanded armies and shaped continents, and he would whisper to them, asking why their strength had died in him. He begged for answers, for miracles, for redemption, but there was only silence. Some said he was mad, others said he was possessed. Servants claimed they heard him pacing at night, muttering to shadows, convinced the ghosts of his forefathers were watching him. Maybe they were. Maybe they were watching the slow extinction of their own empire. And yet the irony was cruel. Charles II, the weakest king in Europe, ruled over the richest lands on earth. His colonies stretched across oceans filled with gold, silver, sugar, and slaves. But the wealth never reached his people. Spain's golden age had turned to rust. The mines of Potosi were running dry. The galleons were sinking, captured by pirates or swallowed by storms. And in the heart of Madrid, the royal family still held parades as if the empire hadn't already begun to die. By the time Charles reached adulthood, his body was already collapsing. His jaw locked shut, his teeth decayed, his skin turned ashen. He could not eat solid food, could not father a child, could not even hold a sword. He became a symbol of everything Spain refused to face: its pride, its decay, its denial. The priests called him blessed, the people called him cursed. But in truth, he was both. A man caught between the illusion of divine right and the reality of human ruin. And yet, despite his weakness, the fate of nations still rested upon him. Because without an heir, the question loomed like a storm over Europe. Who would inherit Spain's empire when the bewitched king died? That single question would ignite secret wars, shift alliances, and determine the future of the world. But for now, in the flickering candlelight of a dying palace, Charles prayed on his knees, trembling, whispering to a God who no longer answered. The empire that had ruled the world was falling apart, and its last king was too fragile to stop it. Power doesn't die, it hides. And when the king is too weak to rule, others rule through him. By the time King Charles II reached his 20s, Spain had already become a ghost of its former self. The royal palaces still glimmered with chandeliers and gold leaf, but behind those walls, the real kingdom was controlled not by the crown, but by those who whispered in its ear. The corridors of Madrid's Escorial Palace were filled with spies, priests, and nobles, all pretending loyalty, all clawing for control of the dying empire. The true monarch was not Charles, it was fear. His mother, Queen Mariana, had built her entire rule upon it: fear of God, fear of sin, fear of losing divine favor. Every decision she made was justified as holy will, every rival silenced as an enemy of faith. But faith is just another kind of weapon when it's wielded by the powerful. Behind the closed doors of her private chambers, Mariana was not praying for Spain's salvation. She was praying for her own survival. Because outside those walls, other vultures circled. The nobles of Castile despised her Austrian influence. The church eyed her control with suspicion. And foreign powers, France above all, saw the weakness in Madrid like blood in the water. At the center of this storm stood a man named Father Nithard, a Jesuit priest who had become Mariana's confessor, advisor, and shadow. He held no title of nobility, no military power, but in 17th century Spain, the word of a confessor could damn or redeem an entire kingdom. Nithard convinced the queen that the devil was working against her, that her enemies were possessed by demonic forces sent to destroy her son, and she believed him. Soon the palace became an exorcism chamber disguised as a court. Nobles were accused of witchcraft, rivals disappeared, and every failure of the state, every lost battle, every famine, was blamed on curses and sorcery. But while the court hunted witches, France hunted Spain. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had already transformed France into the richest, strongest nation in Europe. He looked at Spain's weakness not with pity but with hunger. Through spies and marriages, he crept into Spain's affairs, waiting for the day the cursed king would die childless. The throne of Spain was not just a crown, It was a gateway to an empire that stretched across the world, and every power in Europe wanted it. Meanwhile, Charles lived in confusion, a puppet who thought himself pious. His days were filled with endless prayers, rituals, and ceremonies meant to cleanse him of curses. The priests around him claimed that he was the victim of a hex, that witches had fed him poisoned chocolate, that demons whispered in his sleep. And in the flickering candlelight, the king began to believe them. He refused medicine from doctors, trusting only holy water and relics. When he fell sick, he demanded that his servants sprinkle salt in the corners of his room to ward off spirits. He spoke less of politics and more of omens. He believed that his own body was a battlefield between heaven and hell. It wasn't entirely madness, it was desperation. Because no one around him told him the truth, his sickness wasn't spiritual, it was genetic. His deformities, his infertility, his constant agony, they were the legacy of his ancestors' sins. The same blood that gave him power was killing him from the inside. But while Charles prayed for healing, others prayed for his death. The court split into factions, each loyal not to Spain, but to their own ambitions. One faction, led by Queen Mariana and her Austrian allies, wanted to keep the empire tied to the Habsburgs of Vienna. The other, quietly supported by France, wanted to hand the Spanish crown to a Bourbon, a descendant of Louis XIV. Each faction bribed priests, courtiers, and generals. Each spread rumors and forged letters. Spain's royal court became a labyrinth of betrayal, where truth and lies were indistinguishable, and the king was the only one who didn't know who truly ruled. Then, in 1677, a new player entered the board, John of Austria the Younger, Charles's illegitimate half-brother. Charismatic, ruthless, and ambitious, he was everything Charles was not. The people adored him because he looked like a real king, strong, confident, decisive. The nobles saw in him a savior who could rescue Spain from foreign control. And so began a silent civil war within the palace. John accused Mariana and Father Nithard of corruption and treachery. He spread stories that they were using sorcery to control the king's mind. Crowds began to gather outside the palace, chanting for the priest's expulsion. Fearing for her life, Mariana agreed to send Nithard away, but her power did not vanish with him. She found new confessors, new puppets, new ways to manipulate her son's fragile mind. John of Austria became prime minister and tried to restore Spain's dignity, but even he could not cure the empire's decay. The treasury was empty, the army unpaid, and the colonies slipping away. Yet for a brief moment it seemed hope had returned. John began reforms, purged corrupt officials, and challenged France's growing dominance. But power in Spain had long ago ceased to be political. It was spiritual, or rather, the illusion of it. The priests who surrounded Charles whispered that John was cursed, that he plotted to dethrone the rightful king. And as the young monarch grew weaker, those whispers turned into royal decrees. In 1679, John suddenly fell ill and died, poisoned, some said, by the same court that had once begged him to rule. Once again, Spain's fate fell into the trembling hands of the bewitched king. Desperate to produce an heir, Charles was forced into marriage, not once, but twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, was terrified of him. She was only 17 when she arrived in Spain, a bright young girl thrown into a world of candlelit superstitions and suffocating silence. Her letters home described a kingdom trapped in mourning, a husband who barely spoke, and a court obsessed with omens. She withered away under the pressure, dying young and childless. Whispers said she had been poisoned too. Charles wept for her, or perhaps for himself. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, came from Germany, chosen for her family's reputation for fertility. But even she could not break the curse. The king's body was too broken to father a child. As the years dragged on, the empire's vultures grew bolder. France, Austria, England, all waited for the inevitable. They knew that when the bewitched king died, the world would burn. The War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would engulf Europe and the New World alike, was already being planned in whispers. And all the while, in his dark, echoing palace, Charles prayed harder than ever. His mind, poisoned by superstition, turned against itself. He ordered investigations into witchcraft, demanded exorcisms, and even ordered the unthinkable, the exhumation of his own ancestors' corpses to find evidence of curses. Imagine that. The last king of the mightiest empire on earth, surrounded by skulls and bones, convinced that somewhere among them lay the secret of his suffering. He was no longer a ruler, but a relic, a living symbol of decay so complete it had become holy. The empire's fall wasn't sudden. It was silent, like a candle dying in its own wax. And in that silence, the puppeteers of the crown kept pulling strings, not realizing that the stage itself was burning. By the late 1690s, Spain was a ghost wearing a crown. Its ships no longer ruled the seas. Its gold no longer filled the vaults of Madrid, and its once mighty king had become a shadow of flesh and bone. King Charles II, the man the world called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, spent his final years moving between his palaces like a wandering spirit, searching for peace. Every morning the priests would lift his fragile body from bed, clothe him in layers of royal silk, and present him before courtiers who bowed not to the man but to the myth, the living proof that divine right had rotted into divine punishment. His eyes, sunken and watery, scanned the faces around him, men who swore loyalty with their mouths while measuring his coffin with their minds. And somewhere deep inside, the king must have known his death would not be the end of him. It would be the end of Spain. His body was breaking in ways no human body should. His tongue was swollen, his bones soft, his stomach unable to hold food. He had seizures, fainting fits, and long spells where he forgot his own name. At night he claimed to see figures in the corners of his room, his ancestors, pale and silent, staring at him through the dark. The priests told him it was the devil tormenting him for the sins of his bloodline. But the truth was more horrifying. The devil had never needed to enter the palace. He had been born there. Centuries of intermarriage among the Habsburgs had twisted their family tree into a noose. They had preserved their pure blood, but in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. Charles was the final chapter of that divine arrogance, a man born to rule the world, yet too fragile to rule himself. The court's obsession with witchcraft reached fever pitch. Every night, the palace echoed with the sound of Latin prayers and whispered exorcisms. The queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, surrounded herself with mystics, promising that if her husband's curse could be lifted, he might still produce an heir. The air smelled of incense and decay. Monks sprinkled holy water on portraits, relics, and even the royal bed. One monk claimed that a demonic presence had entered the king's body through his hair, so they shaved his head and burned the clippings. The king, trembling and exhausted, let them. He believed every word because it was easier than facing the truth, that he was dying, and with him, an empire was dying too. Outside the palace walls, Europe waited like wolves, circling a dying stag. Louis XIV of France sent secret agents to Madrid, bearing gifts of medicine laced with poison and letters wrapped in deceit. Austria sent envoys, urging the king to name their candidate as heir. England and the Dutch Republic plotted alliances, calculating how to divide Spain's vast colonies once the crown fell. Every letter Charles received carried a lie, every messenger an agenda. And still, he prayed for guidance. He turned to his confessor, Father Froilan Diaz, who told him that his curse could only be broken by confronting the evil within his bloodline. That advice would soon lead to one of the most morbid acts in royal history. In 1698, the king ordered the exhumation of his great-grandfather, Philip II, the architect of Spain's Golden Age, to prove whether the dead monarch's body had been corrupted by demonic forces. The tomb was opened, and the court gasped as the corpse was found perfectly preserved, skin unrotted, robes untouched by time. To the priests, it was a miracle. To Charles, it was confirmation that he had failed to inherit divine grace. Even in death, he whispered, they are stronger than me. After that day, something inside him broke. His prayers turned into accusations. He accused his servants of witchcraft, his doctors of betrayal, and his wife of sleeping with demons. By 1699, he had stopped eating entirely. He told his confessors that the Virgin Mary came to him in visions, warning him that the devil's seed had already entered Spain. Whether he meant the Bourbons of France or the Habsburgs of Austria, no one knew, and perhaps neither did he. Then, in October 1700, the end came quietly. Charles lay in his chamber at the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, surrounded by candles and whispers. His breathing was shallow, his skin yellow as parchment. As the final mass was read, his eyes opened one last time. "I am not bewitched," he said faintly. "I am punished." Moments later, the last Habsburg king of Spain was dead. He was 38 years old, but his death did not bring peace. It brought chaos. When the embalmers opened his body, what they found became legend. His heart was black and shriveled. His intestines decayed beyond recognition. And his skull, they said, contained only a spoonful of brain. The report, whether true or not, spread across Europe like wildfire. The man who had been called the most cursed king in history had become a cautionary tale, proof that even divine blood can rot. Charles left no heir, only a will that handed the entire Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. It was exactly what France had planned for decades. The Bourbon dynasty would now sit on the Spanish throne, and Europe erupted. The War of the Spanish Succession began within months, dragging the continent into one of its bloodiest conflicts. Spain's colonies in the Americas, its fleets, its gold, all became bargaining chips in a war that reshaped global power. The sun that had once never set on the Spanish Empire finally disappeared beneath a horizon of fire. For centuries, historians debated whether Charles II was truly bewitched or merely broken by his own lineage. But maybe the truth lies somewhere between medicine and myth. His curse was not cast by witches, but by ambition, by a dynasty so obsessed with purity that it poisoned itself. The Habsburgs had once ruled most of Europe, claiming to be chosen by God. And yet their final king spent his life haunted by devils. There is a strange symmetry in that, as if history itself was mocking the arrogance of power. Today, his story survives in the quiet rooms of museums, in portraits where he stares blankly into the distance, and in the bloodlines of the royals who still rule Europe. His name, Charles II of Spain, is a footnote in textbooks, but behind that name hides a warning written in bone and crown. That power built on illusion will always collapse under its own weight. The nightmare that lived within him was not just his. It was the nightmare of every empire that forgets its humanity in pursuit of eternity. And as the candles flickered out in that royal chamber, the echo of his last breath carried a message across the centuries, that no throne, no dynasty, and no godly right can protect a man from the truth written in his own blood. This was not merely the death of a king. It was the death of a myth, the myth that divine power can escape decay. And that is the story King Charles II tried to hide from the world. Like, share, and subscribe to Pastify Hub, where history's darkest truths come alive once more.